Oh dear. Hey guys, and welcome to the Coffee and Coding Podcast, the show where we discuss everything there is to know about app development. In today's episode, I talk to Android and iOS developer Hage van Veen. We talk about everything related to code sharing between iOS and Android. Specifically, we discuss Kotlin multi-platform, what it is, how and when to use it, and how Kotlin multi-platform can benefit your multi-platform apps. We also touch a little bit on J2C, which if you don't know is a Google command line tool that lets you convert Java code written for Android to Objective-C code so it can be used in an iOS app. So if you're someone familiar with working on multi-platform apps and the challenges that entails, then listen closely, as this was definitely an eye-opener for me. Now on to the show. So I guess the first question, if you don't mind, is to kind of start at the start, which is how did you get into development?
Well, it started directly after university. I did a computer science master, so obviously you get into the development then. And I wasn't sure what to do at first, and I was looking into game design a little bit, but that didn't pan out. And it turned out that what was gonna be, or was sort of already one of the largest meal delivery companies in continental Europe. They were in the town that I was living in at the time, and so I applied there for a job for the first job that was available, which was an Android developer, and that's how I became an Android developer. And then from doing Android development for a little bit, out of necessity, I also became an iOS developer there, because it was easier to hire a new Android developer than for me to just teach myself iOS, and because you sort of already know the platform. That's how I became also an iOS developer.
So you're talking about both natively, right?
Yeah, both natively. I've never actually done anything with like Xamarin or Node.js, or like I know from those platforms in theory, but I've never actually used them.
Okay, so I assume you started Android with Java.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And then how soon on the Kotlin bandwagon, or how early on the Kotlin bandwagon were you?
Very late. We'll get into that when we talk about what I'm doing with native code sharing. But I've actually only been using Kotlin for like a year or so. So it's really relatively late. But to me, it was a pretty straightforward move, since I was already used to Swift. Swift and Kotlin are really, really similar. So essentially, you only have to teach yourself a little bit about coroutines and you're good to go.
So, side question, if you already know Kotlin, how easy is it to get into iOS development with Swift? Or is there a whole nother level on top of Swift that you would need to get on board with?
Well, and this is something that you'll run into with any code sharing platforms. The biggest differences are not the language. Like almost every single language is the same. Like if you teach yourself Java, it's not that difficult to get into C++ or whatever. There's just some language differences that you need to take into account. Obviously, there's memory management, and that's a big difference between iOS and Android, because Android's a garbage collector and iOS doesn't. So you have to take that into account. And of course, there's just differences in how you build an interface. So like the whole view lifecycle of a screen, it's different between Android and iOS. But yeah, basically those things are documented, and you can teach yourself about it. And, I think a lot of developers tend to be like, oh, I'm an Android developer, or I'm an iOS developer. But if you're willing to look at both sides of it, then I think you're actually, you don't become the best Android developer or the best iOS developer, obviously, because you have to distribute your time a little bit. But you do become a pretty decent app developer, I think, because it helps you think about how the app works and not how the platform works.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. Let's dig into what I would say is your specialty right now, Kotlin multi-platform.
Yes.
So the first I've heard of it is very recently. I have a brief idea of how it works, but for people that don't, can you give an overview of what is Kotlin multi-platform and what can you do with it?
Yeah, sure. So Kotlin multi-platform is a part of Kotlin. As you might know, Kotlin is developed by JetBrains, the developers for Android Studio, for instance, but also the whole IntelliJ platform. And since they make a bunch of compilers, including an iOS one with AppCode, they realized, hey, there must be a better way to do things than just to write apps twice, because that's essentially what's happening with almost every single app that you download in the App Store, right? So if you need an app, then someone builds it on Android, and then another one has to port it into iOS, and they basically have to rewrite it from scratch. So IntelliJ, JetBrains stuff, there must be a better way. And since they make compilers, they are pretty capable of doing that. So what they decided to do is they made a compiler that compiles Kotlin code into LLVM code and LLVM is so basically just C code for iOS, and just plain Kotlin for Android, of course. And Kotlin multi-platform, it also works for not just for iOS and Android, by the way, but also for JavaScript, C compiler, whatever you want. So basically, the way that it works is you sort of have a different level of abstraction where you can declare that you expect a certain pattern to arise, and you declare that expected pattern in your common code, and then you can make in platform-specific code, you can make actual implementations of.
So in that context, sorry to interrupt you, what is a pattern?
Well, that can be anything, actually. So imagine just imagine some architecture that you have. So you have a view model. You can imagine that you need something like that, right? And a view model is pretty useful to write in common code because it contains a bunch of business logic. It might also just be a model that contains some business logic. But now you need to introduce something like permissions. So you need to, your view model needs to require permissions to access the camera or whatever. Now, obviously, the way permissions work is different between Android and iOS, right? But the pattern for the view model might be the same. So just I want a permission, and you'll get a callback. And
I gotcha. So your pattern would say I want permission, and then you implement how you get the permission, or you handle the permission on the platform specifically.
Exactly. So by doing so, you basically you have to write your business logic, which doesn't care about how you get permission. You only have to write that once. And you can write the platform-specific levels twice, obviously. But it reduces a lot of code, actually. It allows you to reduce your patterns. And that's going to be very useful if you really want to do code sharing. So I already mentioned, like, I'm pretty late in Kotlin, right? And one of the reasons for that is, and I'm going to sidetrack this a little bit to explain the journey here. Before I used Kotlin Native, I was working on an app, and we had like this very complex app. So we had like signal processing and Bluetooth connections, and so we were actually Internet of Things connecting with the device. And as you can imagine, that's pretty bug-prone, right? So you sort of don't want to write it twice, because if you have two developers each writing it, then you have two potential points of bugs. And that's sort of what you don't want. And at that time, Kotlin wasn't even a thing yet, so Kotlin multi-platform also wasn't there yet. But Google actually had a library once upon a time, or it still has, but it's not that widely used anymore, called J to Objective-C, and it was a transpiler. So that literally transpiled the Java code that you wrote completely into Objective-C code, actually. And it was a proper transpilation. So it actually threw null pointers if you had a null pointer, which is not something that Objective-C should do, but it did. So realized, hey, this is pretty useful. We can use this to make this whole complex app, just make the complex parts once, and then basically write interfaces on top of it. Now, obviously, since this is J to Objective-C, Java to Objective-C, it didn't work with Kotlin, so that's why I was late into the whole Kotlin flow. because basically as soon as Kotlin came out, we couldn't do anything with it except maybe write a few interfaces, but that didn't really make all that much sense. So then Kotlin multi-platform came along, and that made, since we already have like experience with this whole what I call native code sharing setup, we started moving into Kotlin multi-platform, and it's been proving pretty useful for us as well. It's newish and still very experimental, but it's also it reduces a lot of workload, as long as you have developers that have Android and iOS developers that are willing to work together.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, so I have a bunch of questions on that. So the first one is, just for clarity, Kotlin multi-platform is to share essentially business logic and not building UIs and stuff on two separate platforms.
Yes, and sort of no. Like so, Kotlin multi-platform, it actually on the platform specific levels, it does have full access to all the platform libraries. So you can write a view controller and activity.
So there is that option to do it, but it's not. I suppose it's not built for that in the same way that Xamarin or React Native was built for cross-platform.
No, there's a bunch of people that say that it actually should work pretty well with Flutter. So you can imagine that you write your interface components in Flutter and your business logic in Kotlin multi-platform. I haven't tried that yet, but theoretically that should be possible. It's really useful for indeed sharing your business logic, and since it's not just iOS and Android related, but also Java related. You can also imagine that you write your data models and share them between your backend and your front end. So you might have some business logic that both sides need to do in terms of conversion or whatever. You can also write that.
So in theory, you could write a piece of business logic that could live on a web app, on an iOS app, and an Android app. Exact same logic.
Exactly.
So then you could have essentially any of those team of developers could update the business logic, and it would update for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can just run tests, and you can run tests on your iOS piece of code and on your Android code to make sure that it actually runs on those platforms properly.
Okay. So I guess the next question is, how easy is it to get started with Kotlin multi-platform in terms of, so firstly, how do I get started? And then how do I get whatever I've just written into an Android and an iOS app?
So it's all mostly through Gradle. So you can basically, as long as you have Android Studio installed and you have Kotlin in there, you can just implement the multi-platform plugin and you're basically good to go. Obviously, there's some Gradle setups that you need to do, and I'm not going to give you the exact details because it's easier to just read it, because I don't know them from the top of my head either. But basically just go to the Kotlin website. And there's a pretty easy to look tutorial there too.
So I assume I create like a Kotlin project, or I could create a Kotlin project. You've got the multi-platform plugin. You can write your code.
Yeah.
How does that work in terms of, for example, if I wrote a Java library, it would create a jar, and then I could export that to iOS, or I could export that to Android or whatever. So how would that work in terms of how does that deploy to different things? Does like iOS import the project, or is there a file that it imports, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it sort of depends. Like obviously you can't import everything, because if something has an Android specific dependency, then obviously it won't work. But you can import basically any Gradle, any Kotlin project through Gradle if it's just common Kotlin multi-platform. There's a bunch of libraries right now. It's not the biggest set yet, but you can get there. You can also import things specifically for Android and for iOS. So if you need like Coin, for instance, you can do that on Android. And on iOS, you can actually just import any Objective-C framework as well. So just grab anything that you want. The only thing it doesn't support yet is full-on Swift libraries.
Would you say that the Kotlin multi-platform right now, is that, like, if I was going to use it, is it production ready, or is it beta, or is it, what's the status? Like, would you put this in a production app?
The company I work for, we have it running in some production apps, and it is working. So in that sense, it's production ready. However, it should be noted that it's still very much in flux. So the language still changes a lot. Like Kotlin itself is still very much a language that's changing a lot. And that's even more true for multi-platform. So actually, they released a new version, they released a new version of Kotlin 1.4 today, and that's also including some new very important multi-platform things. For instance, up until now, it wasn't possible to use suspend functions on the Swift side. So yeah, it sort of depends on what you want. If you want a very straightforward some basic business sharing, then it's definitely pretty useful. If you want to do some more complex things, and I think we should get into the disadvantages in a bit there, then those are things that you need to consider, and that you might want to consider delaying it a little bit. But it's definitely worth experimenting with, I think. And if you're starting a new app project, then you should definitely consider code sharing in the first place, I think. It makes no sense to a customer to say, I'm going to build an app for you, but I need twice the amount of people that you want because I need to buy the app twice. And like if you have a big project, it doesn't make sense.
So let's say you are starting a new app, and like you said, code sharing makes sense if you can do it because you don't want to have to write everything twice. So would you start with, would Kotlin multi-platform be your go-to for that code sharing, or would it be something else?
For now, yeah, definitely Kotlin multi-platform. Yeah, I've been working with it for a while now, and I'm actually working on the library to make things easier for everyone. So I just recently finished the MVVM architecture components for it. So once all that's ready, I also hope I can share it with more people and everybody can start using it. Because I really think it's potentially going to be the future.
So I can see that the use case for code sharing in terms of, business logic, just basic business logic, if this happens, then do something, and you want it to be the same on both platforms so it's not buggy on one. But what's some of the either more complicated or more interesting use cases that you've used it for, or that you've seen other people using it for?
So one of the more interesting, I think, right now is, for instance, we're working on the Bluetooth library. Bluetooth is actually pretty complex, and I'm sure everybody who's been following all these COVID-19 tracking apps is pretty aware of it by now. It's complex, and also basically on both iOS and Android, the Bluetooth libraries are a mess. Like they're pretty terrible, actually. So we've actually been porting the Bluetooth library into like this really nice flowable version of Bluetooth, where you can just say, I want a flow of all my Bluetooth devices, and you can just grab it, and it just works. Like, it pings you for permissions, it sends you all the data that you want, and so it takes you a while to obviously get there, but then once you have it, you have just a Bluetooth library that works natively for both platforms. And you can do common things with it. You can just say, okay, I want, for whatever Bluetooth device that I get, I want to read its characteristics and update it and whatnot.
So based on that, essentially, if you put the time in, you could abstract a lot of what you can do on an OS away from the OS level, and essentially end up with just a library that does all of these different things, and all you would have to write natively is the UI.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm advocating. Yeah, so I think since I've been the J2EE one, I've been doing that for like 5 years now. So in that sense, I'm pretty well familiar with how to do code sharing as a whole. And what I've learned is that you really need to think about a proper architecture that works for both platforms, and that's usually going to be MVVM because that's just the easiest one to do. But if you do that, and if you do it properly, then you can invite your view models and anything below it in your Kotlin or your code shared language. And you just have to do some platform specific things like, how do I grab permissions and some other stuff. Like, I think even for networking, there's like a Kotlin multi-platform library that you can use, so you don't even need to worry about that. already handled for you.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if you could do Bluetooth, then you could definitely do networking. And then essentially you could abstract everything away apart from the really specific things like the differences between the two platforms. That obviously there's no point being multi-platform if one platform doesn't have it. That's really interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think because there's definitely more. I guess I'll just ask you, how do you see this maturing and how do you see, so for example, Kotlin works for Android, but it wasn't officially supported and then it got a bit more supported and a bit more supported and now it's baked into Android Studio. So how do you see from the way that Kotlin multi-platform is progressing now, that going, and do you think it's always going to be this side bit that you can add to projects, or do you see it being more widely adopted where it's kind of baked into Xcode or Android Studio or web development tools?
Well, I definitely think that that's the goal of JetBrains. So JetBrains is pretty focused on getting this out there, right? And since they're probably the most powerful IDE maker in the world right now, they have a pretty heavy. They have a good foot to put down on the skills. I do think, however, that since we're talking also about Apple, that making it an official iOS language is probably a bridge too far for a very long time. So will it be the proper standard for iOS development? No, not in the first few years. But it's already in Android Studio, and you can already, like, I think you can even in Android Studio basically just click and give me a multi-platform project and you get it. So, and if it's not an Android Studio, then it's definitely in IntelliJ itself. So, yeah, it's gonna be a reasonable expectation from IntelliJ's perspective to say that that's gonna be how you're gonna set up your apps from now on. Of course, that also depends on how many libraries there are, and that's going to take a while because it's a new language, and well, it's not really a new language, but it's a new way of thinking, obviously, and that takes some time to mature. You still have to do a lot of inventing the wheel yourself right now because nobody has done it before.
So, just aside from the Kotlin multi-platform, so you've obviously done like Jxc and you've worked on code sharing a lot in between different iOS and Android apps, which is something that I've not done everywhere that I've ever worked. Has been two different platforms with two different code bases, and it works on one and then it doesn't work on the other because we've implemented things slightly differently. So let's say you've got two apps and they've both been built separately and they're fairly mature apps, and as you move forward, would you personally look to stripping out the business logic between the apps into a shared component? Or would you say, they're already separate, so let's keep them separate and move them forward in that direction?
I definitely consider it. Like I'm running into that where the project I'm doing as well right now, and it's like they're basically two apps and they have two different architectures, so they're completely different. They need to do exactly the same, but they're clearly written by two different developers, and then there's developers left, and then me and my company we came in, not my company, but the company I work for. So then we came in and we're obviously like, okay, now we have to do this upkeep again, and we sort of don't want to do this because in the long run it's a waste of time to write apps twice. So yeah, if you have a mature app and I'm gonna be maintaining it for the next 2 years, then definitely consider it. Especially if you already have like an MVVM-like solution in at least one of them. If it's already a Kotlin MVVM model, then it's super straightforward. If it's just Swift, then it's a bit less straightforward, but also pretty decent support because, as already mentioned, Swift and Kotlin are virtually the same, except for some differences. So I think the upgrade is actually, if you have a really decent mature code base, it's not that as painful as you might imagine it is. Obviously start small, but so start with just doing it for one screen. But if you do it if you're in it for the long term, then yeah.
Okay, makes sense. So in terms of the actual Kotlin multi-platform itself, you've talked a lot about the positives, but what would you say are the key drawbacks right now of going in that direction?
Well, one of the drawbacks is obviously, as I already mentioned, that it's still very much in flux. So you should expect that that JetBrains is going to release a new version of Kotlin and half of your project breaks. That's going to happen, and I can promise you that's going to happen a lot in the next few years. The other thing, and the biggest thing I think that's holding a lot of developers back, and especially iOS developers, is the memory model. So I'm not sure how familiar the listeners are with the iOS memory model, but you have automatic reference counting, right? So in Swift code, basically you have a reference counter and it goes up if you reference to it, and it goes down if you stop referencing to it, whereas Kotlin has a garbage collector. And Kotlin multi-platform actually also has a garbage collector, even for code that you created from Swift. So the garbage collector is there. You don't really need to take into account automatic reference counting. But in order to make it work, JetBrains had to make a few they ran into some issues, some limitations. And the biggest limitation for that is that they actually use memory freezes. And by that, what we mean is that if you run two things in two different threads, then a variable is either immutable or it's shared across multiple threads. So as soon as you want to share it, then you need to make it immutable, and you can never make it mutable. And that's obviously a very big limitation if you're if you run into threading issues. Now, what we've seen is that actually, as long as you use coroutines, it's not that big of a deal, because basically with coroutines, since they're already like these small mini threads, you can all run them on the main thread and it's all still working. Nevertheless, you need to consider, you need to take it into account that obviously your memory is going to be a bit tricky. And I think the third thing is that it really requires you to have a basic understanding of both Android and iOS. That's always going to be the case when code sharing comes in, because there's always a limitation of what Android can do or what iOS can do. And obviously, once you're abstracting things, you also need to abstract things that platforms can and cannot do. So that means a lot of conversation. If you're an Android developer who has never touched an iOS app, then you need an iOS developer to help you there, and vice versa. That's a bit of a drawback. I think it's actually good in the long run, because you should be an app developer, not an Android or an iOS developer, in my opinion.
So just jumping to that memory issue quickly, what would be a practical example of that? Is it kind of like you're doing something on a thread, say networking, and then you want to switch to a different thread because you need to do some data manipulation, so you have to make the response from the networking mutable, or am I getting that confused?
Yeah, basically that. But it's already even complex that if you want to pass a closure to it, then that's obviously also a variable or something in memory. So that's also frozen, and this actually breaks. So if you pass a closure from one thread to another, it kills itself. It doesn't work. So you need to be aware of in which thread you're running. But again, with coroutines, it doesn't really matter, because you shouldn't care what thread it's running anyway.
Okay, so it's a disadvantage, but it's just if you're aware of it, it's less of a disadvantage.
Yeah, it's something you need to be aware of, and it can be tricky, and you sort of need to break your old memory patterns. You really need to understand coroutines if you want to use Kotlin multi-platform.
Have you ever worked with Xamarin or a React Native, or do you have any opinion of how that compares in terms of using that as opposed to this approach where you have two separate apps but they share code, as opposed to one code base that deploys to two separate applications?
Yeah, as mentioned, I've really never used Xamarin or something similar, so I can't really give you an expertise opinion in it, other than that my experience as a user is that you can sort of always notice that it's
you can tell.
Yeah, right. Like I have this app for Keybase, like the chat app, and it's like if you scroll through the messages, it just jumps up and down, and you can just tell that it's a Node.js, I think. Like you can just feel that something's wrong there. native code has less of that because the interface is still native, and so it just works. It runs like it should run because it's still basically the platform.
Yeah, I gotcha. All right, so some quick fire questions, which is more about you than multi-platform, and then at the end you can tell us, because I know you're doing a talk if that event is still on. Is it this month or next month?
I'm supposed to speak about this at AppDevCon in Amsterdam in September, but since in the Netherlands over here the lockdown is, or the events are still on hold until the start of September, I'm sort of anticipating that won't go through, but you never know. If it's gonna be held this year, then I'll be there hopefully. What you can also find me for is I already sort of mentioned that I was working on the library. It's called Kaluga with a K, like every single code library, of course. It's not fully production ready yet, but it's still very much in development. But please have a look if for anyone who's interested. We really hope that we can sort of make all these annoying Kotlin multi-platform things that everybody needs to do, like the permissions request and like I mentioned Bluetooth and I mentioned MVVM. We sort of want to make it all just once and make it good and make sure that people can use it if they want to, and then they can focus on actually just writing those nice Kotlin multi-platform apps rather than making the architecture components to do so. So hopefully that will take off a little bit. We hope it will.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I'll link it to the show notes for this episode so people can definitely find it and go and have a look. So just a random fun one is, what machine do you use to work on?
I just work on a MacBook. Like I just checked it for you. It's a 2018 one, so it's not even the newest one. Pretty decent processor though. It doesn't really like me compiling both Android and iOS at the same time, but
does the job.
Yeah, it does the job. It's like with the COVID-19, obviously we're working from home right now, and so it's and I work a lot in public transport, so it really helps me a lot if I'm just on the MacBook where I can just work on the fly. And obviously a MacBook because I'm also an iOS developer, so I wouldn't work with a Linux or Windows machine because then that would just be horrible for my iOS development.
So you mentioned about it's good to be an app developer and not necessarily, restrict yourself to I'm an Android or an iOS developer. So what are any kind of like tools or tips or tricks or things that you think people should know if they want to become an app developer? So they don't just want to be Android, they don't just want to be iOS. Like, what would be the key thing that you would say you should be familiar with or you should know? Or
to me, it's really just know how the life cycle works. Like if you know how the life cycle works in Android and if you know how it works in iOS, then all the rest it's pretty straightforward. And I think the second thing is, if you want to be a good app developer, learn a decent architecture. Just don't just write everything in your master view controller activity or whatever. Like, teach yourself a good architecture. I don't care if it's Viper or MVVM or MVP, but whatever you pick it and do it well, and try to teach yourself about what makes platforms the same and also what makes it different, and then you should be good to go, I think.
What do you think, and this is just general development, what do you think separates an okay developer from a great developer?
Communication. Basically, just make sure that if you have an issue, if you have an idea, that you can make yourself understandable to another developer. If you make something, you sort of the other developer should be able to understand it right now, and they should be able to understand it in 2 years' time. Just don't assume that because you can do it right now that others can understand what you're doing. So be communicative. That's, I think, the biggest, most important thing.
Okay, so we know, fingers crossed, maybe you'll be speaking at AppDevCon in September.
Mm-hmm.
So last thing is, where can people find you, or where would you like people to find you online?
You can follow me on Twitter. That's Daeda88, Daeda88. I work for a company called Splendo. We're always hiring, so have a look at our website, splendo.com. We're based here in the Netherlands, for those who might not know. You can always find me there as well. I think that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Or if you want to shoot me an email with questions about this, it's gijs@splendo.com.
Is there anything that you wanted to mention that I didn't ask?
No, I think this was a pretty clear conversation of what I can tell you about Kotlin multi-platform. Just go try it and see if you like it.
Big thanks to today's guest, Hage Van Veen. You can follow him on Twitter at DEADA88 or follow the link in the show notes if that's easier. No, that's definitely easier. And you can find the Kaluga library he mentioned at github.com/splendo/Kaluga. As always, you can find everything we talked about in this episode in the show notes. If you like the show, tell a friend, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. It's much appreciated. And if you really like the show, you can support it with a coffee donation at coffeeandcodingpod.com/buymecoffee. Caffeine is literally what fuels this podcast. If you'd like to connect with like-minded developers, you can do so in our Facebook community. And finally, you can follow me on your favorite social media platform at lowcarbrob. You can find all the links to everything I've just said in the show notes or at coffeeandcodingpod.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Coffee and Coding Podcast.